You should have just got a recording sign on your computer screen. Just go ahead and hit OK. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us for the first Inclusion Talk series of 2023. I'm so excited to welcome you. If you work at Compass Family Services, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. If you are outside of Compass Family Services, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Deferred, and I am our Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging, and I'm so excited to welcome you. I can't wait to introduce you all to our illustrious speaker, Dr. Lerone Martin. I'm going to read the bio and then transfer it over. Dr. Martin is an associate professor of religious studies and the Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Chair and Director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford University. Previously, he was a member of the faculty in the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics and Director of American Culture Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. Martin is the author of the award-winning Preaching on Wax, the Phonograph, and the Making of Modern African-American Religion. The book received the 2015 First Book Award by the American Society of Church History. In support of his research, Dr. Martin has received a number of nationally recognized fellowships, including the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, the Teagle Foundation, Templeton Religion Trust, and so many more. He has been recognized for his teaching, receiving institutional teaching awards, as well as fellowships from the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning in Theology and Religion. His commentary and writing has been featured in the New York Times, Boston Globe, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, CNN, C-SPAN, and PBS. He is currently working on, or may have finished, his most recent book, Between the Relationship of the FBI and White Christian Nationalism, published by Princeton University in 2022. Everyone, I'm so pleased to welcome our guest speaker, the first speaker for the Inclusion Talk series of 2023, speaking about a dream deferred, Dr. Lerone Martin.
Client just now.
Everyone, if you're here, please put yourself on mute. Thank you so much. And Dr. Martin, I'm going to spotlight you for the crowd. The show is yours.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I'm so thankful to be here with all of you. And I'm honored that you have made me your first speaker for 2023. And I can't think of a better figure or a better person that embodies all that what you all do at Compass Family Services than Martin Luther King Jr. And I'm so excited to be with you all. So if you all can see my slides, I hope that everything is all right. Rhett, is everything? Give me a thumbs up. Can you
Everything is good, Dr. Martin. You're good to go.
Okay, great. So I'm going to start a little bit and talk a bit about what we do here at Stanford in terms of working with you all to continue King's dream and his work. And then I'll talk a little bit more about King himself, and then we'll have the time for question and answer. So thank you again for your time. So to start off, I'm at the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford University, and we have some basic goals that we have. The main goal is to preserve and promote the work and legacy of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. That is our main goal, and that is the work that we do. And we do that in a couple ways. We do that through research, we do that through education, and we do that through public events or public impact events. This is how this institute started. It started in 1986 when Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King Jr.'s widow, was looking for someone to edit her husband's papers, was looking for someone who would collect and edit and publish all of her husband's papers. And she was looking for a young historian in order that would bring things together. That was young historian was not me, but it was my predecessor, Claiborne Carson, who's pictured here next to her. And from there, the King Papers Project was started. So that is the first thing that we do in terms of our research, and that is with the King Papers Project. This is an effort to make the writings and the spoken words of one of the 20th century's most influential figures widely known through publication. It is also by publishing a comprehensive collection of King's most significant correspondence. That means sermons, published writings, and unpublished manuscripts. And also to publish these volumes. So we've published 7 volumes thus far, and our plan is to publish a total of 14. Now, this is what these volumes involve. Let me just share with you briefly. These volumes essentially are anything you can imagine you've learned about Martin Luther King Jr., whether you've heard it in a documentary, you've read it in a book. What we know about King, a great deal of it comes from our research project in these volumes. The first volume was published in 1992. It was a volume called to Serve, and looked at King's life from his birth in January of 29 until 1951. One of my favorite volumes is volume 6, which we went out of chronological order because my colleague, who was outstanding, Tanisha Armstrong, back in the early 2000s was visiting Coretta Scott King before she passed away, and discovered a box at Coretta's house. And this box contained all of King's early sermons. So these are the sermons he preached all the way beginning in 1948 when he was a divinity school student, up until March of 63, right before the March on Washington. That's probably one of my favorite volumes. And then our last volume that we published was volume 7, To Save the Soul of America, which covers January 1961 to August of 1962. Now, these volumes are available for available for purchase at bookstores and online, et cetera, et cetera. Let me just show you a bit about what's contained in these volumes, things that many people have never seen before about Martin King Jr. Here, for example, is a childhood photo of Martin Luther King Jr. My historical expertise guarantees that what I'm about to tell you is true, and that is that we often see King in a shirt and tie, but I can guarantee you he didn't arrive that way. This is a picture of King as a child at the age of 1. We have photos such as this, which is a King family portrait from 1939. And then this photo you see Martin King there at the bottom right, his sister Christine, who's a year older than him, his brother Alfred Daniel, who they called AD, who's the baby brother. And in the middle, you see Reverend Martin Luther King Sr., King's father. To our left is King's mother. And then to the right is King's grandmother, who they all lived together. So these are some of the photos and things that we have, that we've published, that we've brought to the public to help get a better understanding of King's life. We also have photos such as this, King at the young age of 6, somehow still managing to look dapper and fresh as could be, even at the age of 6, with the butterfly collar and so forth and so on. So these are some of the things we have. We also have letters that he wrote as a teenager, wrote home from summer camp. This is in King's own handwriting, writing to his dad, "Dear Father, I'm very sorry," and so forth and so on, that it's taken him so long to write home. We also have his senior photo, a young man just graduating from college in 1948. So these are some of the things that we have. And on our website, which is listed here, we have a number of things which you could check out as well. When we signed the agreement to publish these things, it was in the 80s. And as you can imagine, no one was thinking about digital publication. So where we are now under my leadership of the King Institute is thinking about moving this forward so that we can bring this lesson and bring these rare archival holdings of Martin Luther King Jr. to a broader public. So they're not just contained in books, but actually available to be digitized on our website so the whole world can see. We do have some things on our website now if you want to check it out, which again is listed up on your screen. A couple of other things that we do, we have the Institute, we have the world's largest archival online holdings of King materials. We are the most visited MLK website on the internet. We prepare documents for online access and maintain an extensive digital document database that you are available to use and on our website and see and find and read about. We also have previously inaccessible King speeches, sermons, and letters, as I said earlier, which allows you to see Martin Luther King Jr. as a pastor, right? So often we see him speaking in front of large audiences and giving addresses, but this volume 6 in particular allows you to read King's sermons to see how he pastored people through challenging times, through poverty, through death, through loss, and through challenges of life. And so that's one of the things that I love about our website. And finally, we have other things that we do besides the research we do, which I pointed out, the King Papers Project, but also we do some things through education I think that you might find interesting. For example, we obviously offer courses to our undergraduates here, but we also offer a course for high school students. I'm just launching this semester as of last Monday. We have launched a class through students at Camden Prep in Camden, New Jersey, who take a class with me on Martin Luther King Jr. and also get Stanford credit for the course. And these are only students who are at Title I high schools where at least 40% of the student body are on free or reduced lunch. And so they're getting not just the information about Martin Luther King Jr. and thinking about how Martin King might apply to their lives, but they're also getting Stanford credit, which is giving them an opportunity to prepare for college. And this is especially important at Title I high schools. We also have research fellowships for our undergraduates here at Stanford, where they can come and work with us and work in the archives and actually get a hold of some of King's early writings and things about Martin King. And then we do events such as this, public impact work. We've published books. There is an autobiography of MLK. MLK never wrote an autobiography, but King did indeed write a number of things about himself. We compiled those and made those into an autobiography. We have an MLK encyclopedia, which gives you basic information about King. We also have a college prep program where we're going to start next summer. We're going to invite kids from Title I high schools across the country to come to campus and take a class with us and get acclimated to being on a college campus to prepare them for college and using the study of Martin Luther King Jr. to do that. And we, of course, we have a scholar and writer in residence program named after King's attorney, whose name was Clarence Jones, and where we invite experts who come and utilize our resources here at the King Institute. So that's a bit about what we do in public events such as these. Now, what is it exactly that we're trying to communicate to the public about King's dream? This is what I want to share with you all today. And this is why I think what you all do at Compass is so important, because you really do embody what King talked about in his dream. Now, obviously, we know that King talked a great deal about racism, but King had what he called the evil triplets. King believed that racism was one of the evils facing American society, but it was not the only one. He also recognized that its connection to poverty and its connection to militarism or war, because King really believed that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So how does this all work together? King obviously believed that racism was a sin. It was not just a preference of sorts, but it was actually a sin. And King really believed that that was important, that we recognize racism as a sin. And King saw that racism was a problem because of the way that it caused some individuals or some groups to feel they were superior to some because of the color of their skin. That was wrong, but it was also sinful and wrong because it caused folks who had darker color skin to think that they were inferior. And for King, he believed that that was completely wrong. And he also argued that any society that would make someone or isolate someone and take away from their opportunities because of racism would obviously almost damn that individual group to poverty. And they would not have the opportunities for enrichment and for flourishing, so they would be damned to poverty. And then, of course, he thought that America's commitment to violence and war was problematic because it not only dehumanized human beings, right, but it also used money for weapons and for war, and money that could be used to help alleviate poverty and help alleviate racism in American society. So King saw these things all go together. And this is something I know that you all know so well at Compass. And King called these the evil triplets, or the triple evils. And King believed that these were the three things we needed to fight in order to make America a more perfect union. And it's important that we always remember that, because King is often thought of someone who only fought against Jim Crow racism, who only fought against the signs that said colored only or white only. And if we limit King to that, then we can argue that King's dream has been realized. But if we recognize that King was concerned about these three major evils, we recognize that we still have much work to do in order to accomplish King's dream. Now, the major principle for how King thought about all of these things was the Imago Dei. And that is a fancy Latin theological term that's been used that argues that all human beings are made in the image of God. This was the primary foundation of King's ideas, is that all human beings are made in the image of God. So with that foundation, this is how King thought about these triple evils. First, he said that racism was a problem because it was a moral problem, because he said that all segregation statutes are unjust, because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. In other words, it distorts the image of God that every human being reflects, and it damages individuals. So he said it gives the segregator a false sense of superiority. That's why it's a moral problem. It gives some groups an idea that they're better than other groups. And then it gives a false sense of inferiority, right, to the segregated. So this is why King saw this as a moral problem, something that was sinful and wrong, not something that was just a preference, but something that was completely wrong. Now that relates to poverty. He saw poverty as a moral problem because he saw that in America, we had a group of people, mostly people of color, and also white brothers and sisters who we know, and those who are on the margins as it relates to gender and sexuality as well, right? We're on in an island of poverty, he said, right? That this has caused a great deal of bitterness, it's caused a great deal of irony, and that America, right, has a great deal of resources that it uses, but it chooses to use them for other means, such as militarism, which I'll get to in a second. So King also saw poverty, again, as a moral problem. And then, of course, violence he saw, and that violence destroys human personality. And that King really believed that in order to enact violence on someone, you had to dehumanize them. You had to make them less than human. And we've seen this, unfortunately, time and time again. Most recently, many of us have seen what's happening in Memphis. And we ask about how that type of violence can be enacted upon another human being. Part of it is to dehumanize the human being, right? And King believed that violence was a problem because violence only begat more violence. And so for King, violence is both a human problem, but it's also a problem of resources that could be used and dispersed in a different way to help humanity flourish as opposed to destroying humanity. Now, for King, how do we respond to these things? How do we respond to racism, poverty, right? How do we respond to the problem of violence? Now, King said there's a couple ways people have thought about this. We could acquiesce, in other words, we could just accept these sorts of things, right? But King says that leads to moral and spiritual death. If we are just to accept these things, it leads us to, right, to have a moral conscience that is dead, right? A moral conscience that just is saying, let's let whatever happens happen and not care about others. Clearly, that is not something that you all believe at Compass, or you wouldn't be doing what you do in terms of serving humanity the way that you do. But King said the other way is often thought about is that people have thought about this through violence, that one way to respond to racism, poverty, and militarism is by the use of violence, or responding in violence. And King thought that only begat more violence and didn't actually arrive at what the end that you seek. So King believed that violence only led to more brutality. And for Martin King, it's important. King actually believed that one's means have to be commensurate or equal to one's ends. So if you seek a society of peace, a society of morality, you have to use moral means to get there. So King would say, if we want a peaceful society, we can't use violence to get there, is what King would say, right? So this is something that we don't often see in our politics today, where we see sort of raw, brute power. King would say, no, if you want a peaceful moral society, you got to use morality, you got to use moral means to get there. You can't use immoral means to arrive at a moral end. So that's what King believed in. So for King, the only moral way to protest these things was by nonviolence, right? And so for King, nonviolence was a way of life. And as I stated, your means have to be commensurate with your ends or equal to your ends. So King believed that nonviolence was the only way to respond to these issues. He said that nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding, right? To gain understanding and win friendship. He said that nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice, not people. But nonviolence, he believed that suffering can educate and reform. He believed that by using media and television, seeing African Americans physically suffer for rights that should have been their own at birth, he believed that that could somehow educate the public and then lead to reform. He also believed that nonviolence chooses love, and that's creative love. King was very keen on this, that love is not something we think of that is just sentimental or anemic, he would say, right? But love is about power implementing the demands of justice, right? And so love is not something that's weak or passive, right? But it's love that's seeking to be creative, to create justice in the world. That's what love is for King. And that King was a Christian. Many of you know he was raised in the Black Christian tradition. So he really believed that God was on the side of justice, that God was on the side of the oppressed. And he looked at the Exodus story. He looked at countless stories in the Bible where it seemed that the divine was acting on the behalf of the oppressed. And King, as a minister, really believed that. And so in implementing these nonviolent protests, many of us you get the idea from watching the videos, from watching YouTube clips, that it seems as if these protests just happen, right? But for Martin King, these things don't just happen, right? There's a process of a nonviolent campaign. It's not just people getting together, being upset, but this is a long, long, long form of planning that King taught. The first thing that has to be done in a nonviolent protest is a collection of facts. King really believed that research was important. You had to have a collection of facts where you understood exactly what was happening, who was being oppressed, who was not being served, who's being marginalized, who's suffering for various reasons. Have a collection of facts. This is where research becomes so important. So you understand exactly what is happening in a particular situation. The second thing was education. King thought that once you had a collection of facts, you had to go through a process of education, that both the leaders of a social nonviolent campaign had to be educated on what was going on, and also the local community. Let's make sure everyone's educated and on board about what exactly is happening. This to me seems like it is so important today, especially given in the age of social media that we live in and misinformation. It's important that for a nonviolent campaign, King would argue, that you have to have a process of education where the dispersal of facts and ideas, right, are disseminated into the community. Then he would say, you go through a process of negotiation. You actually go to those in power and actually seek to negotiate and say, we recognize this individual, this group of people, that they are being mistreated, they are being marginalized. We want to come to you and now negotiate with those in power to alleviate this situation. If the negotiations breaks down or those in power refuse to negotiate, then King says, and this is important, this is where his Christianity comes into play. Then King said that one had to go through a process of self-purification, that you had to go through a process of working on oneself so that you are ready and prepared to engage in a nonviolent campaign. And for King, this was a process of making sure one was willing to count the cost and go through a nonviolent campaign. As most of you know, when you are hit or struck or threatened, it is human nature in many ways to respond in kind. This is why Martin King thought it was so important to go through a self-purification process in order that one would be prepared to engage in a nonviolent campaign and not strike back. And so for King, this is an important aspect of a period of rehearsal. A number of these campaigns, individuals got together and rehearsed And we're prepared if the police do this, or if the oppressors do this, this is how we're going to respond. All of that was a process of self-purification to make sure that a nonviolent campaign remained nonviolent. And then direct action was made. This is where we know that King would have protests outside of certain establishments, or whether it would be the Montgomery bus boycott or other forms of direct action. And this is after all of this is going on, then you move to direct action. And hopefully at the end, you end up arriving at a reconciliation between those who are in power and those who have been marginalized from power. Now, the goals, of course, in that for a nonviolent campaign are deliberate. It's first and foremost for Martin Luther King Jr., you want to create a crisis or tension, right? So for King, this was important, right? I recall during Colin Kaepernick's protest of the American flag, and no matter what one thought of his protest of kneeling during the national anthem, one of the things I kept hearing people say is that it's not the right time. Football Sunday, it's not the right time, right? That's the point of a nonviolent campaign, right? Is to actually create a crisis or a tension. It's supposed to be at an inopportune time, right? So in order to get attention to one's goals and campaign. So for Colin Kaepernick, he was trying to draw attention, he said, right, to police brutality. So he was using the time of football as a time to create a crisis or tension. And he was successful in doing that. It was a conversation that went across the nation. And that was what, in many ways, what King was trying to do and did accomplish in the 60s by creating a crisis, right? By creating tension for people not to be able to avoid the issues at hand. That's what was that's a goal of a nonviolent campaign. It's also to dramatize the issue. African Americans during the civil rights movement, as you know, were going through a host of brutalities, beaten for trying to register to vote, houses being bombed for daring to say that they were deserving of equal citizenship. So King's nonviolent campaign is seeking to dramatize all that is happening to African Americans during this moment in time, to bring it to the public so that it can't be ignored, and to dramatize that issue in order to get media attention. It's also aimed at changing the oppressor. We know that those who are oppressing, those who are putting people down, King's goals were to, right, change those oppressors, right? But it was also to change the oppressed. King also sought to make sure that those who were participating in nonviolent campaigns would be completely transformed and changed by participating in their own liberation and transformation, right? And that's important. I know that you see that in your work as you work with families who are at risk, watching as they participate, right, in the changing of their situation, how it changes them as well, right? So what are some of the places King engaged in these nonviolent campaigns? Many of you know already of the Montgomery bus boycott, where King was elected the spokesman of this boycott, led by African-American women, the Women's Political Action Committee there in Montgomery, who were leading the boycott, doing all the hard labor. They looked to Martin King as a minister who was young, who was educated, to be the spokesperson. And King was the spokesperson of the Montgomery bus boycott, which vaults him to fame, where the African-American community there was being denied equal ridership on the buses. They engaged in a campaign that went over 365 days, boycotting the buses and then gaining the right to have equal ridership and equal rights on the Montgomery city buses. And that's what vaults King to fame, of course. He had a number of campaigns that were not successful. I'm happy to talk about that during Q&A. But the next most notable campaign, of course, would be Birmingham, Alabama, where King chooses around the Easter holiday to engage in a boycott of the downtown stores, where people will be shopping, seeking to buy their Easter outfits. And so King is protesting during this time to draw attention to the fact that the Birmingham downtown stores were not treating African Americans equally. African Americans couldn't use a dressing room. Oftentimes they had to go into the back to receive their items, or could not sit at a lunch counter in downtown stores and to be treated equally. So King engages in a campaign there in Birmingham, which proves to be successful and really pushes President Kennedy to propose the Civil Rights Bill, which is later passed. Of course, we know the March on Washington. This is where King gives the famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And it's important that we recognize that the March on Washington was fully titled the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And that's important, that it was also about jobs. And one of the demands of the March on Washington was, of course, for the desegregation of institutions who received federal funds, but it was also for a mandatory livable wage for Black and white workers who were engaged in various laboring jobs across the country. And King's "I Have a Dream" speech is so amazing and so phenomenal. And we have a rendition of that on our website. But if you listen to the talk and the rhetoric, of course, of "I Have a Dream" is so powerful. But prior to that, King is talking about police brutality. He's talking about poverty. He's talking about insecure housing, all of the issues that you focus on campus. King is talking about that on the March on Washington speech that often gets lost because of the soaring rhetoric of "I Have a Dream." But King was squarely concerned about all of the things that you are concerned about as well. Selma, which we all know probably for the Ava DuVernay movie, was in 1965, where King was marching for a voting rights bill to be passed in the United States. African Americans were being brutalized and beaten and ostracized from the ballot, and being treated unequally when trying to register to vote or being threatened to vote. So King engaged into a march in Selma to Montgomery, which was the Alabama state capital, to put pressure on the federal government to engage in to pass voting legislation, which of course passes in 1965. A campaign that is akin in some ways to some of the work that you all do was in Chicago, where King marched for open housing, where African Americans were being discriminated against and not able to purchase homes in certain neighborhoods. He decided to do a campaign. King moved into the west side of Chicago in the Lawndale neighborhood, in a dilapidated apartment. He lived there and engaged in a campaign there in Chicago to try to force the city to take down discriminatory housing practices there. He even tells of a story where they sent a white couple who was working for King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and took them into a real estate office. And the real estate agent said, "Well, what do you all want? We have houses across everywhere. We're happy to serve you." And then after that, King sent an African-American couple to the same office, and they only showed the couple houses that were squarely within underserved neighborhoods, even though the family could afford to live anywhere in Chicago. So King was trying to bring exposure to this issue and also, of course, to tear it down. King was assassinated in Memphis in 1968 there in a campaign for the sanitation workers there who were being mistreated and not being paid. Several African-American sanitation workers had been murdered on the job for lack of safety regulations. And so King was there in Memphis where he was assassinated, engaging in a campaign to try to help striking sanitation workers. When he died, King was planning on having a poor people's campaign, which was going to bring Black and white poor people from across the nation to the nation's capital to camp out in DC to demand poverty legislation and to fix America's social safety net. That was the campaign King was working on when he was assassinated. And I think that's an important campaign. Many, including Reverend Barber and others, today have tried to resurrect this campaign, but it's a campaign that is near and dear to the kind of work that you are accomplishing at Compass. So some of the more landmark legislation that King was a part of pushing forward in America, as I said, of course, the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, which created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to address race and sex discrimination in employment and in a community relations service to help communities solve racial disputes. And of course, it also authorized the federal intervention to ensure the desegregation of public accommodations, schools, parks, swimming pools, and restricted the use of literacy tests as a requirement for voter registration. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 abolished literacy tests as well, and poll tax. And of course, it also gave the federal government the authority to take over registration in counties with a pattern of persistent discrimination, and had a pre-clearance provision which said that counties that had practiced persistent discrimination, before they could change their voting registration requirements, had to be cleared by the Department of Justice. Now, of course, this has recently been stripped. That pre-clearance provision has been stripped from the Voting Rights Act. And now, of course, as soon as we saw that, we saw a host of municipalities and states try to resurrect voter ID laws, which in many ways have disenfranchised certain populations from voting, especially those who are people of color and those who are underserved and in poverty. And finally, one of the last testaments of King was the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which was passed a week after his death, which was better known as the Fair Housing Act, which prohibits discrimination concerning the sale, rental, or financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, and sex. Now, I don't have to share with you all about what King endured as a result of pushing for these sorts of changes. And I think this is important for us to recognize. King is the only person that has a statue on the National Mall in our country that's not a president. And many of us see those statues on the National Mall as national heroes: George Washington, President Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, right? We know of these FDRs there. We know of these presidents that are lionized. But I think it's important that King is not only the only person there who was not a president, he's also the only person there who was deemed an enemy of the state. And it's important for us to recognize that in pushing for these things, while America now celebrates Martin King and has a holiday dedicated to him, during the time he was alive, he was hunted and hounded by the FBI. It was considered as America's most dangerous Negro, and that's a quote from the FBI. He endured surveillance by the FBI, beginning explicitly in 1963 after the March on Washington, until his death in 1968. The FBI did everything from bugging his hotel rooms, tapping his phone at his house, the phone of his friends, including Clarence Jones, who's an attorney who's worked with us here at the King Institute, even to go as far as to send King a doctored letter. They sent him a letter that was supposedly written by an African-American Christian, but was drafted by the FBI, saying that he was a fraud and that he would be exposed, and that if he didn't want to be exposed, that he should consider the letter intimated that King should consider taking his own life. This was the kind of stress Martin King was under for trying to create change and trying to alleviate these triple evils. I think it really was driven home to me by Clarence Jones, the King's attorney here, when he shared with us that when King was clearly under duress, got the FBI sending him letters threatening to expose some of his activities or to break up his marriage or to spread rumors about him, that King was severely under duress and was going through a bout of depression. He was drinking, he was smoking, he was acting out in behaviors that were not healthy, as many of us know happen all too well when you engage in service and volunteer and you experience burnout. King was experiencing what we would call burnout today. And King's physician said this man needs to see a therapist. He needs to see someone because he's going through a significant bout of depression. All of King's friends, including Clarence Jones as his attorney and others, said, we don't think King should go see a therapist. We're not going to let him because we know or are terrified that the FBI will break into the therapist's office and get copies of the therapy notes and use those to discredit Martin Luther King Jr., that he's somehow mentally unstable. That's always struck me as the amount of stress he was under, that he couldn't even go see a therapist to help him through some of the things he was working through because of his efforts to work for change. That was the level of stress that King was under. Now, as we think about all that King accomplished, of course, King asked before he passed away, and in an important address he called "Where Do We Go From Here?" which was then later a book that was published after his death. He asked the question about where do we go from here, community or chaos? I think it's a really important question for all of us to consider. And there are a number of things I think that we should focus on. Now, we know that King helped to dismantle racism in this country as it relates to Jim Crow, right? As it relates to signs that say blacks here, whites here, et cetera, et cetera. But you and I both know that racism, this monster, is not dead, right? That this monster is still alive. And so we have to think seriously about how we're going to combat racism, how we're going to fight both racism in terms of interpersonal racism, meaning that racism we experience on a day-to-day from individuals, but also structural racism, the way that certain things in this world, in this society, are structured to advantage some people and not others. How we're going to do that. How we're going to be aware of poverty and economic exploitation. I don't have to tell you all that poverty is still very much so with us, that while America is one of the richest nations in the world, we still have significant poverty. So we have to ask the question, where do we go from here as it relates to poverty and economic exploitation? And finally, war and violence. We're still experiencing war, we're still experiencing violence, we're still experiencing all that King talked about, both in terms of wars between nations, but also violence in terms of police brutality and violence in our communities. So where do we go from here? The thing that I would offer is this, that if we're going to honor Martin Luther King Jr., I think the best thing that we can do is to make Martin Luther King Jr. our conversation partner. Make King someone that you converse with. If we're going to honor him, converse with him. And by that, I mean, not looking at Martin Luther King Jr. as a fount of all wisdom, or as Martin Luther King Jr. as a model that we should seek to replicate to the exact T, to do everything that King did. We live in a different time. We're still fighting racism, but we're fighting a kind of racism that King in many ways did not see or could not have anticipated. We're fighting poverty in terms of, right, financial technology, the way that poverty is being is spread, the way that economic exploitation is happening by use of technology and targeting of folks and algorithms. And of course, we're dealing with a different form of violence. And also our young people are able to see this violence on their phones and on social media in a way that King could have never have imagined. But King can still be our conversation partner. He can still be someone we can look to, we can read his sermons, read his work, read about him, and see what he did well, and see what he did that maybe didn't work so well, and then incorporate that into our own arsenal for change. That, to me, is the best way for us to honor Martin King and to continue to work to make his dream a reality. Now, we all know, I'll say in closing, that Martin King was raised in the Christian tradition. And part of that Christian tradition recognized that when God or the divine or the universe or whatever sort of ultimate reality that you ascribe to, when you are called or have the opportunity to create change, many of us might feel intimidated or afraid. In the Christian tradition in which Martin Luther King Jr. was raised in, oftentimes you see that people are called by the divine and they are afraid. So there's a story in the Bible about from Moses, when God calls Moses to liberate his people. Moses's response is, "I'm slow of speech," or basically Moses had a stuttering problem. And God says to him, "I don't care, what's in your hand?" And then Moses, in his hand, he had a staff, and he used the staff to set people free. We see in the Bible the story of Esther. Esther, who was a queen who was put in a position of power, who didn't really believe that she could have any type of input, but she used what she had, her appearance and her position of power, to bring about change. And even in the story of David and Goliath, David was a small shepherd boy. He felt called to go out and fight. When God was called him, he said, "All I have is these three stones." He used those stones to slay the giant. King was in Montgomery, right? People called upon him to be engaged in the bus boycott. He didn't start. He said, all I have is this education and this voice and this ability to articulate people's pain, and God used what he had. So I would say to you all is that one of the things we can learn from Martin King is to simply use what's in your hand. You don't have to be able to speak like Martin King, to lecture like Martin King. You don't have to have a PhD. But when the opportunity comes to you, when the universe presents you with an opportunity to serve and help others, all the universe asks of you is that you use what's in your hand. Whatever you have, whatever resources, whatever gifts, whatever talents you may have, use those, right, to bring about a more perfect union. And in doing so, we'll all work together to help bring about King's dream and bring about a more perfect union in the kind of world that King cared about and dreamed about, the kind of world where we help to dismantle the triple evils. I want to thank you all for your time. I'll stop sharing my screen now. And I believe that, Rhett, we have a time for Q&A. So I really appreciate your attention.
We absolutely do. Thank you, Dr. Martin, for your time and for that powerful presentation. Those words are so powerful, to use what's in your hands. So thank you so much. For everyone that is here, thank you all so much for being a part of that. You can put your thank yous in the chat. Dr. Martin will see them. Also in the chat, you'll notice I hyperlinked his books and where you can get them if you want to continue to read more of his scholarship. And please don't forget to fill out the post-inclusion talk series survey. I am going to work with our impact and learning team to make the graphics wonderful and share that with Dr. Martin, as we are so honored to have him as our first speaker for 2023 to honor the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. With that, what I want to do is I want to turn it over to you all. I want to see if you have any questions for Dr. Martin. We have about 12 minutes together, so I really want to turn the floor over to you. If you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand or to come off chat. You can also drop it, or come off mute. You can also put it in the chat box. I will read it for you if you'd like. As you think about that, Dr. Martin, I'm going to spotlight you again. Hopefully you can hear still. I would love to know your thoughts and opinion on the embrace, the new statue or monument in Boston Commons, the largest racial justice monument. I have my own feelings on it, but I would love to know what you think about the embrace.
You know, I appreciate you asking that question. So on one hand, what I'm happy about is that it brings Coretta into the story, and that, you know, Coretta, and I'm happy to talk more about that maybe next year, but Coretta was such an important influence on him. One of the things that we have at the King Institute that I believe is available online, but certainly in our autobiography of MLK, is Coretta and King are, when they're dating, they're exchanging letters with one another and they're learning from one another. Coretta's writing him about economic exploitation. She's recommending books for King to read. So their courtship is actually really beautiful. I mean, they're exchanging these letters where they're learning from one another. He's learning from Coretta. And we can also learn from their relationship that in many ways, King, unfortunately, was a visionary as it relates to race in this country, but was still slow as it relates to gender equality. So even though Coretta was this brilliant human being in and of herself, King was still stuck to an old way of thinking that Coretta would be best served by staying at home with the children, because that was the way King was raised. His mother was educated, but stayed home with King, was forced to stay home with King and his siblings. And he learned a great deal from his mother. So he saw that as Coretta as well. So I think what's beautiful about the statue is that it brings Coretta into the story in a much needed way. You know, Coretta has not received her due. Now, I'm not an artist, Brother Rhett, but in terms of the execution, I would have liked to have seen a better way in which that would have articulated how intertwined their lives were and how intertwined Coretta was and helping Martin King and do all that he's done. So artistically speaking, I'm not an artist. I can barely draw a stick figure, but I think I think that their execution could have been a little more let's see, forthcoming, I should say.
I appreciate that. I agree. Brother Hank Williams, who won the contract to design it, is brilliant.
Yes, he is.
Like you, because I know a bit of the history and how intimately interwoven they are into the Boston community, with them both having studied their graduates degrees there. It is very interesting when I saw it from all different angles and hearing from Coretta's cousin and his thoughts was very interesting. It looks like Montez in the chat said, are any of King's family members currently involved in the King Institute?
Sorry about that. I was on mute. We have a agreement with the estate that represents the King family, where we are responsible for, again, as I stated, editing, annotating, and publishing King's entire archive, which is massive. And the agreement we have with the estate outlines how we are to do that. And one of the things that we are to do is to make sure what we put up online is transcribed, but is not done in a way that can be downloaded for folks to download these things and then use them for their own commercial purposes. So that is the agreement we have with the estate that represents the King family. And that was the agreement that we've recently come to, given that technology has changed. And when Coretta mandated that we do this, none of us were imagining, right, we could read an entire book on a phone this size, right? So we've had to adjust with times. And so part of that adjustment has been working with the estate that represents the King family to outline the parameters of how we are to bring King's archive to the world.
Excellent. Question, Montez. Was someone going to come off chat? Please, feel free.
Yeah, Rent. I was going to say this, Jackie. I was going to say, one of the famous parts of my life was to go to the national park and to sit there where the memorial is for them both. And it's such a profound, it's like, it's something that you would love to just be in the presence of, because whatever transpired in their life transpired in death, where they're still together right now, so I appreciated the presentation that you brought. Thank you so much for the information.
Yeah, Jackie, excellent point. For those of you that are Compass members and even non-Compass members, Jackie has written an article that's going to be posted on our Compass blog about her experience visiting the King Memorial site and the burial site, so be on the lookout for that. Does anyone else have a question that they'd like to ask? Please feel free to come off mute. I have a question in the chat, Dr. Martin, and it says, do you speak at high schools in San Francisco?
I have not had the opportunity to do that as of yet. I've been in this area now for a year, but I would love the opportunity. Part of what I'm passionate about and making the King Institute is helping to pass down this information to high school students and young adults. Obviously, I do it here with college students in the classroom, but part of our high school college prep program and the course I'm doing right now with the students in New Jersey is to pass down this information to the next generation. I think that because King has been incorporated so much into the American story, I think that some young adults don't see just exactly how radical King was and how useful he is as a conversation partner. So I would love the opportunity to engage high school students in a number of ways, and we're trying to do that now, but certainly open to speaking at high schools as well. I'm speaking at San Mateo Community College coming up here this month, and also I'm speaking. I've spoken at a community college. You have to forgive me. I'm still new to the California. It's been a year. It's near Stockton Delta Community College. There it is, up in the East Bay. So I've spoken at a number of community colleges as well, but not high schools yet. But I'm certainly open to it.
That's an excellent, excellent question, Jane, and I'm so glad to hear that you're open to that. Folks need to know that Dr. King graduated from Morehouse University at the age of 15. That brother was a scholar. I am a bit of a King nerd myself, him being my fraternity brother, and I have seen some things that are just astounding. So absolutely. Next question for you: what inspired you to become a part of the King Institute?
You know, I think it was just the opportunity to be a part of furthering King's legacy. I think I was just, you know, I was happy where I was, but the opportunity when this job opened, it felt like an opportunity of a lifetime to just be a part of spreading King's ideas in a way that will stand the test of time. You know, there are so many things, letters in his archives and sermons that, you know, have yet to be discovered. And just to be a part of that is exciting. I'll just share one thing that I discovered since I came here to this job. For example, King was speaking once in Birmingham, and a white man jumped on the stage and attacked him. And all of the folk around King, you know, bum rushed the stage and were ready to tear this man apart. And King jumped in front of everyone and said, "Stop, don't hurt him. Can't you see he's disturbed? Let's see if we can help him." Things like that I, you know, the correspondence we have and we're going to publish in our next volume, that's just fascinating to me, right? That here's someone who not only spoke about nonviolence, but tried his best to live it. He never punched back. He didn't try to swing back. And he actually tried to help the man. And I just think that's phenomenal, and it inspires me in different ways. And it's just moments like that that remind me that I'm so thankful that I'm here in this position, one that I count as a privilege, but also as an awesome responsibility.
Amazing. And obviously Stanford is so lucky to have you as its Centennial chair. Two last questions, Dr. Martin. One is, you spoke about how radical King was during his time. How does that translate to modern times? Would you say that much of his thoughts would still be considered radical today?
I do. You know, one example I think is great, and I know we're short on time, so I'll make it quick. In 1967, King came to Stanford and spoke, and you can watch this speech online. It's called The Other America. And in 1967, King offered up one way we could help solve poverty was by starting a universal basic income program. Think about that. He said that in 1967. And that is something that politicians are still talking about today and trying to get started nationally. Now, there's been a number of mayors in Atlanta and other major cities that have piloted these programs, but that's just one idea that King articulated in 1967, right? Almost 50 years ago, right? More than 50 years ago, excuse me. And we're still talking about that and chewing on that right now. Many people think it's wild and crazy, but King said in 67 that we had the money, we had the ability to do it as a country. We certainly know we have the money and the ability to do that as a country now. So that's just one example, I think, of a radical idea that King had that is still considered radical, but is still gaining traction as well in our political conversations.
That's fantastic. Our very last question for you, Dr. Martin, is, does the King Institute collaborate with the Black Lives Matter movement? If so, how?
We have not had any official collaborations at all. What I would hope is that our website, as we update it, we try to raise resources so we can start digitizing things at a massive level, that folks in the public, whether Black Lives Matter or folks for their Bible study lessons or community lessons, will be able to access our website and use the resources that are there in the spirit of Martin King and the tradition of nonviolent protest.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin, for your time. Thank you to each and every one of you that are here. If you check in the chat, I linked how you can access Dr. Martin's books, please be sure to support. Also, you'll find the program evaluation. I will collect all of your feedback, work with our impact and learning team to make some graphs very pretty so I can send it to Dr. Martin. Again, I want to thank you, Dr. Martin, so much for your time. Thank you for teaching us about A Dream Deferred, the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. If anyone wants to get in contact with you or learn more, is the best way to look at the King Institute at Stanford. I just want to make sure if anyone on the call that works for Compass or not is interested in following up with you, how can they do so?
Yeah, the King Institute website is perfect for that. I've just got on Instagram, so you have to forgive me. I'm still trying to figure out how all this works. But it's Dr. Lerone Allen Martin. That's my Instagram. I don't know if it's called a handle name. I'm sorry, you have to forgive me. My kids have forced me to do this, and so I'm still getting tutored by my 12-year-old. So that's a great way. And then, of course, the King Institute at Stanford is another way to keep track of everything that we're doing. So I really appreciate this opportunity, and I want to thank you all for all that you all do, for using what's in your hand and making our community a better place and helping to transform lives. I want you to know that I admire you and all the work that you all do collectively as a team. And I can't think of a better organization, I think, that embodies so much of what King stood for. So I want to thank you all for having me and choosing me. I'm flattered and I admire you a great deal. And I just want to say thank you, and to all of you to keep pushing forward and keep moving to make this a better place for all of us. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin. Thank you to each and every one. If you want to give Dr. Martin a round of applause like this, you can. Really appreciate it. This may have been Dr. Martin's first. I'm sure this will not be his last. Everybody, I hope that you have a fantastic day. If you have not already done so, please be sure to sign the attendance sheet, do the evaluation form. Thank you for being here and being present. I hope that everybody has a fantastic day on purpose. See you later, everyone.
Thank you again,
Bye,
Dr.
all.
Martin and Red.
Bye, everyone. See you later, everyone. Thank you all so much. Bye, everybody. Thank you all so much. Thank you all for being present. Thank you all. Thank you all. Thank you all. Thank you all so much. Thank you so much. Dr. Martin, you are fantastic. I knew you would be. I am just so appreciative of you. I will get you that survey feedback. Normally I give people about a week to do it. Had 107 people a part of today's talk. So grateful to have had you. There are other friends of mine that work at tech companies and a few other places. If I have your permission and they reach out, I would love to connect you if they have speaking engagement opportunities.
I would love that. I would love that. That'd be great. That'd be great. And
that's
I'm gonna is there a way that I can have my 12-year-old post on my Instagram about this wonderful occasion we had together?
Yes, absolutely.
See. Maybe I can do it to see.
Yeah, if you look at the calendar invite that I sent you, I attached the flyer that you were a part of today. So you can absolutely just post that with no problem.
The calendar invite, that was back